Yeah. Couple minutes. It's no, it's just this time of the day is better.
Thanks.
Not you.
Because you went that way with
Right.
As a
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, there's one in my one in your.
Okay, excellent.
I didn't have time to read before I think I really did look at this one.
Okay.
They're good, so. Very good.
No, not yet. They've actually a couple of weird here. Certainly. I have to ask you.
too many things have been.
Yeah, it was totally clear when I left. Sure. And then the day after, there was like 30 centimeter down to 30 days. And yeah, and it just like, no worries. Yeah, I know. I think it's fine.
Yeah.
But it's good. It's too much. It's even.
It's a good thing.
It's a lot.
Yeah, America's looking pretty unattractive.
It was.
We always say.
No, we got all the your presentation cut out. The slide to get the snow, but then it's easy for it to see your
If you use Keynote and you have a big screen, you can have this kind of white paper. It's like you can have just one of those.
Yeah.
Terrible thing called Cognition.
I think I
You and I know.
Actually, no, I used to.
But it's better than
I've used
They're online, they're hard to find, but they're there. She comes to me, size of perfect. She says, so we found the theme, we found how to apply the theme in 35 minutes.
That's where
Their Java implementation is around 5 steps.
Perhaps they were all full with perhaps they were all perhaps they've been there for hours. Very organized. Sure. Yeah.
Like develop the bad habits and then, when they give you money the rest of the day. It's really hard.
so the company tower.
Pages is awful.
I like it.
It's proprietary.
Oh, It's your seminar series, do you want to?
Sure. Yep. Well,
Except, no, I want to do this part.
yeah, I was thinking you should.
No, just the one part.
Oh,
And
okay.
it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Ben Zendel from Grenfell, just because I love the euphony.
Right. Well, I will just add to that and say it's been a pleasure to have you here. Thank you for coming to speak with us. And as Phil mentioned, Ben is from Grenfell. He's an assistant professor in the Faculty of Medicine, so it's our first opportunity to have you here, and we're pleased to have you here to speak with us today on the impact of music training on speech and noise perception in older adults. I'm just going to shut this off.
Yeah, sure.
I think that might be best.
Okay. Sounds great.
Yeah.
So, thank you. So, thank you for having me. It's a great pleasure to be here. I'm a new faculty member in the Faculty of Medicine, but my background is actually in cognitive psychology, and my work involves music, speech, aging. So it's by its very nature, interdisciplinary. So it's nice to be invited to the linguistics department where we can talk about speech perception, and I can probably get some novel insights into what I've been doing. As a caveat, I have no experience in linguistics, so I'm really interested in sort of any ideas you guys have. And as another caveat for some of the grad students, if you like what you hear, I'm openly looking for postdocs. So if you're PhDs and like what's going on, let me know. Come talk to me. See what's happening. So today I'm going to talk about some of my work on the impact of music training on speech perception. Speech and noise perception in older adults. I've divided the talk into three parts. First, I'm going to do sort of a very brief summary on auditory aging. It's important to know how the auditory system changes with age before we can talk about how we may be able to improve it. Then I'm going to talk about some research that I've done on the effects of musicianship on auditory abilities across the lifespan. And then I'm going to finish up with some very preliminary data about a longitudinal study where we actually used musical training to try and improve hearing abilities in older adults. So, auditory aging. Now, it's no surprise when I tell anybody that your hearing gets worse as you get older. It's nearly universal. In fact, it's almost impossible to find somebody over 80 who doesn't experience some problem with their hearing. Most people start noticing things by middle age. There's something sort of not as good as it used to be when you were young. Now, that's sort of bad in and of itself, but hearing difficulties and hearing loss leads to a whole bunch of other things that you might not expect. So, the big one is cognitive decline. What you find is that people who experience hearing loss in middle age are actually much more likely to experience cognitive decline later on. It's not 100%, but the study this one looked at two groups of people, one with hearing loss, one without, and then it was like 1% of the people without hearing loss in middle age went on to cognitive decline, like 15% or 20% with hearing loss in middle age went on to have cognitive decline. So there's some associations. It also obviously leads to social isolation. If you can't hear what people are saying, you can't talk to them, and that can lead to things like depression. So hearing really serves as a nexus for a lot of health issues in older adults, and so finding ways to mitigate hearing loss in age is really important. So what is hearing loss and what happens as we get older? So first we should look at the ear, starting with the peripheral auditory system. So the main organ of hearing is the cochlea. Inside the cochlea we have stereocilia, hair cells, and without going into too many details, basically when you hear a sound, when acoustic energy comes in, they move these hairs, and the hairs transmit a signal to the brain as they shear back and forth, and that is what we perceive as sound. As we get older, these hair cells atrophy, the membrane they sit on stiffens. It doesn't take a otolaryngologist to know that the ones on the right don't look quite normal compared to the normal on the left. And that's what happens with age and noise exposure. It's often hard to tease those two things apart because noise exposure accumulates over the lifespan. We can measure this in the lab. And the way we can measure how the hair cells changes by using a test called pure tone audiometry. Anybody who's been to an audiologist would know this test. You hear a sound, you press a button, the sound gets quieter. You hear the sound again, you press the button. Eventually, you can't hear the sound anymore. We can determine the threshold. And so that's what I plotted up here. So this is a threshold measure in decibels and frequencies in hertz on the bottom. So generally you see, and in this case, sorry, the graph, better hearing is up. Sometimes that switches around on the graph, so I'll try and highlight when that switches around. So better hearing is up. So basically the thresholds for younger adults are fairly flat across the frequency range. For older adults, they need louder sounds, especially at higher frequencies. And the reason we know that's a good relation to hair cells is because the hair cells are actually organized tonotopically in the brain like the keys on a piano. So some hair cells are sensitive to low frequency sounds, others are sensitive to high frequency sounds. But we also have decline in how the brain organizes sound. So once that signal enters the brainstem, neurons oscillate actually in time with what you're hearing. So in fact, if you record brainstem activity from a person to a short clip of Mozart and then play that average at like 1,000 times, so you have to play the clip 1,000 times and take the brain signal and play it back through a speaker, you actually hear Mozart. So the neurons actually oscillate in time with the sounds coming in. And as we get older, that neural timing is disrupted, and that's independent of what happens at the peripheral level. And that leads to all sorts of difficulties in hearing, discriminating between different frequencies, how we locate sound in space, determine differences in durations of sound, other tests as well. I'll talk about gap detection and misting hormone detection, what they are exactly in the talk. So we know that age-related decline in peripheral encoding contributes to hearing difficulties, and age-related decline in central processing contributes, and they're independent of each other. And we know that because pure tone audiometry, our measure of peripheral encoding, other measures like autoacoustic emissions and things like that, but they don't always correlate with tasks that definitely engage the brain, which means that there's going to be loss. The loss is independent but related, and it's often very hard to tease those two things apart. What it really leads to, and what the big difficulty is a decline in what's called auditory scene analysis. So what is auditory scene analysis? Well, it's easy if you explain what visual scene analysis is. So I'm standing up here, and the light bouncing off me, bouncing off the table, bouncing off here, hits your retina, and your brain determines where there's lines, where there's boundaries, so you can form objects. The same thing happens with sound. So in an environment like this, it's a very easy auditory environment. There's my voice, maybe the sound of some vents somewhere, people walking in the hall. But all that sound reaches your ear at the same time. So unlike the visual system where things are separated in space, sound is separated by frequencies. And your brain has to organize those frequencies to form what we call auditory objects. So right now your brain's forming an object from my voice and following it as a stream, and you've just separated that door and closing it there as a separate auditory object. You didn't think that I was suddenly making the door sweep with my voice. So the brain will sort of latch onto all sorts of cues to do that. And what it contributes to is a difficulty understanding speech and noise. This is one of the sort of most commonly reported difficulties, hearing difficulties in older adults. And I'm going to show you first how the acoustic environment contributes to that difficulty. So what generally happens is older adults require a greater signal-to-noise ratio. So right now, the signal-to-noise ratio is very high. My voice is loud, and the background noise is very quiet. If we change that, it becomes much harder. So I'm going to play a sentence for you with a bit of background noise, and then I'm going to ask you to repeat it aloud. So listen carefully. There's the high signal-to-noise ratio.
Tear a thin sheet from the yellow pad.
So I hope everybody could hear that. Anybody want to repeat it out loud? Any takers?
Tara tore a thin sheet from the yellow pad.
Close. Tear a thin sheet from the yellow pad. Good. So if we lower the signal-to-noise ratio, so now we're only a 5 decibel difference, it becomes much harder.
Crouch before you jump, or miss the mark.
Maybe the grad students can get that one? No?
Crouch before you jump.
Crouch before you jump or miss the mark. That's it, okay? And then if we put the noise and the speech at the same level,
The square text sounds your Bible formation. You will soak up gentler sound.
any undergrads? No? So it's the square peg will settle in the round hole. So that hopefully illustrates how the physical properties of the environment contribute to difficulties with hearing. But what's interesting is that auditory scene analysis doesn't just rely on the physical properties of the environment. Your attention or task demands in a laboratory experiment and expertise or experience with sound can actually play a big role. So I'm going to sort of show how I hope auditory scene analysis, speech, and music can all fit together. So I'm going to play a section from Brahms' Tragic Overture, and I'd like everybody to just listen and enjoy it for a few seconds. instrument, what was the main instrument that you heard? Violin. So cello. There was a cello. There was a cello. The melody was basically by the violin, and the flute was the other part. So your attention naturally gravitates towards sort of those main melodic instruments in a piece. But with a little bit of guidance and a little bit of shifting your attention, you can listen to a very different part of the musical piece. So let's start with an easy one, the bass. So you're going to hear the same piece, but the first two measures are going to be just the bass to sort of prime you as to what the bass sounds like, and then try, instead of listening to the violins and cellos and flutes, to focus on the bass. Fairly easy to do. The bass occupies its own frequency range and it's fairly easy to attend to. And you can see how just with a bit of change in sort of what you want to do, you can shift how you attend to things in the environment. Now, expertise plays a role too. So we're going to do the task again. This time you're going to hear a bassoon. Now, a bassoon is sort of a low, mid-range instrument. It ends up getting muddied up by a lot of other instruments, and it's quite difficult to hear unless you happen to be a bassoonist and know the frequency and timbre of the instrument quite well. So you hear the same thing. A couple of measures of the bassoon, then the orchestra will come in and try and follow the bassoon in the orchestra. So hopefully that was a little more difficult, and you can see sort of how expertise would play a role in auditory scene analysis. So, to summarize, aging results in a decline in the ability to peripherally encode acoustic information, a decline in central processing of acoustic information. They're not necessarily encoded, or related, but what it means is that we know that this idea of neuroplasticity, the brain changes based on experience, and if central processing declines, things like attention and expertise play a role in how we perform auditory scene analysis, perhaps finding auditory experts might lead us down a path to find ways to help hearing as we get older. So, that leads me to the talks of the effects of musicianship across the lifespan on auditory abilities. So the questions I want to address here are, does lifelong musicianship slow down or prevent age-related decline in auditory processing abilities? And if it does, and I won't be surprised, but it does. How does lifelong musicianship alter central auditory processing by using evaluative potentials to study the neurophysiology that underlies those benefits? So the first study I'm going to talk about looks at 163 participants. About half and half were non-musicians. By musicians, I don't mean symphony players. I mean people who just play on a regular basis. So I think our minimum was at least 5 years of training before the age of 16 and continue to practice sort of minimum of 10 hours a week. So if you play in a rock band on the weekend, you would have qualified, or sing in a community choir, things like that. We did have a few members. I think this study was done in Toronto. I think we had 1 or 2 members of the TSO in the study as well, but we couldn't pick them out based on the data that we fell in with other musicians. And they did 4 tests. The first was a pure tone threshold test, the audiometry test I talked about earlier, and then 3 other tests: the ability to understand speech and noise, gap detection, and harmonic detection. And I'll talk about each one as we get to it. Let's talk about pure tone thresholds first. So on the left is the same graph we saw earlier. So hearing level here and frequency band here. Older adults are in dotted line, younger adults in solid line, musicians, non-musicians in blue and red. We see the typical age effects. Older adults have higher thresholds than younger adults. And the critical thing here, though, is our musicians and non-musicians are not different. So at the peripheral level, music training doesn't have an effect, which was actually surprising. We thought we might see the musicians having more age-related hearing loss because of noise exposure. So fortunately, in this sample, they were matched. We didn't have to do any funny statistical stuff to rebalance the groups. On the other side there, you're just seeing a graph that basically averages across the frequency band to illustrate the decline of pure tone audiometry. So this is just, each point is an average of all of these frequency bands together. So now, what about speech and noise? So the test we did is a standardized audiometric assessment of speech perception called the Quick SIN. Basically, you hear a sentence repeated aloud, and you're scored for how many words you repeat back. And the test is standardized. It gets the background noise gets louder and louder. It's actually the same sentences we just heard a few minutes ago when we tested you on your speech and noise abilities.
Crouch before you jump, or just the mark. No other signal.
Hopefully it's a bit easier the second time you hear it, so you know what to listen for. When we look at the data, we see a very obvious decline in hearing ability. So here again, better hearing is better. A lower signal-to-noise ratio means you have better hearing. Because it's standardized, our young adults all cluster around 0, and as we get older, we get increased variability, but also a general decline. So then the question is, what happens when we compare groups of musicians and non-musicians? And we see, although it looks like a small difference, a statistically significant difference in the rate of age-related decline in our two groups. And it may not look like much, but actually, draw a horizontal line, we see that the average 70-year-old musician is doing the task as well as the average 50-year-old non-musician. So that's 20 years of benefit when you get there for practicing an instrument regularly. So quite a big benefit. And we looked at a few other auditory tests that are related to speech perception and separating sounds. So the first one we looked at is gap detection. So gap detection is the ability to detect a small silent gap embedded in a continuous tone. And why that's important is because detecting small silent gaps is really important for distinguishing things like voice onset times. So da and ta, the voicing starts a few milliseconds later in ta, and that's detecting that small silent gap would be related to being able to do that. And being able to distinguish between those two speech phonemes is going to contribute to your ability to understand speech and noise. So we do the test by playing two sounds to a listener, and then they pick which one has the small silent gap, and it's adaptive. So if they get the gap, we make the gap harder and harder to detect. So they hear a sound like this. No gap. Oh, sometimes it doesn't come through because the speakers aren't great. I'll play one more time and see if we can hear a flutter in it. Maybe you heard a tiny flutter in it. Anyway, sometimes speakers don't pick up the details. The gaps are like on the order of a few milliseconds. So trust me, there was a gap there. And generally, we see it declines as we get older. There's a huge increase in variability, again, with the older adults. But what's interesting is we look at musicians and non-musicians, and musicians shows almost no age-related decline in this ability. Non-musicians show significant age-related decline. Again, could be related to variability. So there's more variability in the non-musicians as they get older. Some of them are actually doing quite well, if you look at some of the red dots down here. And then the last test we looked at was a test that gets at the ability to group and separate sounds that occur simultaneously, but we do it in a lab, so we have to sort of make beeps and buzzes that aren't particularly ecologically valid. But what we did is design a set of stimuli that mimic sounds in the environment, complex sounds. So complex sounds, all environmental sounds aren't just made up of pure tones like what we just heard. A beep is just energy at 200 hertz. But a note on a piano, my voice, is made up of harmonics, music they call overtones. And the nice thing is they have a very common physical property, and that's they're all integer multiples of whatever the fundamental is. So that means what I've illustrated here is we have three different instruments, a guitar, a bassoon, and an alto saxophone. They're all playing a note around 200 hertz, so we have frequency plotted here, and an amplitude measure plotted there. So we have acoustic energy 200 hertz, 400 hertz, 600 hertz, 800 hertz. You just keep adding 200, and that's where the harmonic series is going to be. The shape, the relative amplitude, is what gives rise to timbre, but that's a different talk. What's important is that they're all integer multiples of each other. So we can simulate that in the lab by summing a bunch of pure tones together. And the critical thing about this, when we play this, it's not a pleasant sound, but you hear it as a single buzz. Play it again. Just a buzz. Now, if we take one of those harmonic components and mistune it by a certain value, your brain now says, wait a minute, the physics of the environment doesn't make sense for it to only be one sound. It should be two sounds, because vibrating bodies, anything that produces sound, doesn't produce harmonics that aren't integer multiples of the fundamental frequency. So now when you hear this sound with a mistuned harmonic, your brain hears the buzz, but you should hear what sounds like a pure tone occurring at the same time as the buzz. And hopefully the speakers will play it for us. So I'll play the buzz. So you hear a little pure tone that's separating out on top of it. So that was the test we looked at. We did the same procedure as the gap detection test. We had people listen to both sounds. They told us if they heard one sound or two sounds. They played two sounds and asked them which one the beat was in, two alternative forced choice, to determine their thresholds. We plotted here a percentage of mistuning, so how much we mistune that harmonic. You see young adults are sort of around 2 to 4%, but there is lots of variability on this test, but generally we see an age-related decline. So we need more mistuning to detect that harmonic as we get older. And what happens when we look at musicians and non-musicians? We see a lifetime benefit for musicians. They do better when they're younger, they do better when they're older. And you can see that the ability to separate sounds is obviously going to be important for separating speech and noise, separating more ecologically balanced sounds in the environment. So what did we find? We found there was no differences in the peripheral encoding of acoustic information in musicians and non-musicians. We found slower age-related decline in speech and noise and gap detection thresholds, a lifelong benefit from mistuned harmonic detection thresholds. So what this suggests is that it has to be a central benefit, because they're not better at getting sound in, but they're better at performing the task. So there's something going on in the brain that's facilitating musicians' hearing and facilitating it as they get older. So let's look at the brain. But the first thing we have to understand is that while we've talked about sort of central and peripheral processing of acoustic information, the central system can be further divided, again into two broad categories. The first we can call automatic. So people refer to this as bottom-up processing, exogenous. It doesn't require attention. So we can actually measure responses to sound when people are sleeping, sometimes when they're in a coma. These are just automatic responses to the brain. They're almost reflexive. And then we have more cognitive processes. So these are dependent on attention, like when you were focusing on the bass or the bassoon. We call them top-down or endogenous. They're based on sort of what you want to do with the environment, the auditory environment. And if we just do behavioral measures, it's really hard to tease these two functions apart, because we need them to engage both automatic and cognitive processes to do a task. In fact, we can't really turn off automatic processes unless we kill them or give them some sort of crazy drugs. So, but we can with event-related potentials. So what are event-related potentials? What we're doing is measuring the electrical activity produced by the brain. So the brain is a bundle of billions of neurons. And the nice thing is those neurons, as they fold around the brain, are actually all lined up parallel to each other. And so when an area of the brain does something, if the neurons are all firing in synchrony with each other, these electric fields become strong enough to measure at the scalp. And that's what we're measuring, is these electric fields produced by neurons. Now the problem is your brain has billions of neurons, and we want to focus on the auditory part of it. So how do we do that? Well, we put somebody in, put the cap, measure these electrodes around, and we record this electrical signal coming off their brain. We play the same sound over and over and over again. And on each trial, every time we play a sound, the brain response to the sound should be about the same, right, on a trial-by-trial basis. But the other stuff, what am I doing for dinner tonight, why did my girlfriend dump me, what's going on the weekend, is going to be random on trial-to-trial basis, right? So whatever your brain is doing is, if you average enough of them together, the noise will average out to zero if you had an infinite number of trials, and the signal, the response to the sound, should remain about the same. And that's what we do, is we average it together and we get what's called an event-related potential. So that's a brain potential related specifically to an event after a whole bunch of averaging. And then plot that over the scalp, and we can see a distribution of where on the scalp they're happening. Often where on the scalp they're happening has no relationship to where in the brain they're happening. And that's very important with EEG, because people sometimes get sort of hung up on how come you're recording an auditory thing over the frontal lobes or something, even though the auditory cortex is over here. And it's just because of the way neurons are aligned in the brain. And then getting back to sort of the idea of automatic control processing, is if we want to measure both of them together, we give them a task-relevant stimulus, like what we've done before. Here's a sound, make a judgment. So now they're going to engage both automatic and controlled processing. If we want to minimize controlled processing or cognitive processing, we can tell them to do something else. And one of the common ways is actually you play sounds with people, you put a movie on, put subtitles on the movie, and so they're reading, they don't hear any sounds from the movie, and we just play sounds in the background. So now they're not doing anything with the sound. They're ignoring it. You can give them more complicated tasks to really control their attention, make them do something really complicated like a memory task on the computer or something like that. And that's going to minimize any sort of cognitive or attentional demands placed on the sound system, so you can focus on just automatic processing of acoustic information. And so we did just that, using groups of older and younger musicians and non-musicians. And we presented listeners with a harmonic complex that could be mistuned from 0 to 16%. So those are the same sounds, those buzzes that we heard. So we want to look at how well people could separate sounds and look at their brain responses to it. So in the active task, they heard a sound and they made a judgment. Is this one sound or two sounds? In the passive task, we put on a movie and they read the subtitles, watched the movie, and just didn't fall asleep. That was the only instruction. So what did we look at? Well, first we looked at differences on how concurrent sounds are processed. We looked at task performance. So what was the likelihood of them recording one versus two sounds? We looked at their automatic processing in an ERP known as the ORN, object-related negativity. I'll explain what that is in a second. And we looked at cognitive processing, another ERP that I've called P400. Again, I'll explain what it is when we get to it. So let's start with behavioral data. So what we have is our 6 stimulus types. We get tuned stimulus, and then the third harmonic was mistuned by 1, 2, 4, 8, or 16%. Its initial value. And in general, you see the general plot of the line. All the participants, when the stimulus is tuned, tend to report hearing one sound, or 0% of the trials reported as two sounds. As mistuning increases, their likelihood of reporting two sounds increases to close to 100%. The important thing here is musicians were better at this. They were much more consistent in reporting two sounds. And another important thing to remember is that there was no age-related differences. In fact, here, the stimuli were created in such a way that the older adults did just as well as the younger adults in this case. We looked at reaction time, how fast they respond to the sounds. Again, there's our level of tuning, reaction time in milliseconds. Again, musicians were faster than non-musicians, but again, no age effect. And this was actually quite surprising because in most cognitive tasks, older adults do show a little bit of a slowdown, but in this sample did not. We see a bump here in 2 and 4%. There's a lower reaction time, and that's just because those are the sort of half and half stimuli, so they're harder to judge, and that's why we see a bump, slower reaction time. So now the ERPs. Now there's a lot on the screen here, so we're going to go through it slowly. So first we have our two conditions: active listening. So here's where they're responding, making a judgment, and passive listening. So here's where they are watching a movie. Then our 4 groups: musicians, non-musicians, and then younger and older. So let's start with the gray lines that are hard to see. We're going to get through them fast. The gray lines, the black and gray lines, represent the ERP to a tuned stimulus and the ERP to a 16% mistuned stimulus, or two extremes. So one that's perceived as one sound, and the second one is the response when they perceive two sounds. So we want to look at what the process of separating sounds. So we can figure that out by comparing those two ERPs. And what I've highlighted in blue is the subtraction between those two. So this is the difference between hearing one sound versus hearing two sounds, or the additional neural resources or neural processing required to separate sounds that are occurring simultaneously. And that's what we have highlighted in blue. And we're going to focus on 2 waves. The first one I've circled here is the object-related negativity. It occurs around 150 milliseconds after the sound starts. So this is really fast. In fact, the sounds are 200 milliseconds long, those beeps I played for you. So by 3/4 of the way through, your brain has already decided that there's 2 sounds there. So it's really fast. And we call it automatic detection because we actually see it in both active and in passive listening. So it doesn't matter whether they're paying attention or not, it's there. So this is their brain's reflex. The physical properties of the sound environment suggest that there are 2 sounds in the environment. The second wave I want to look at is called this P400 wave. So this, I say, is related to the cognitive awareness or attentional demands, becoming aware of 2 sounds being in the environment. Why do I say that? Because we only see it during active listening. So you can think of this neural process as being the ORN is sort of the physical properties of the environment suggest 2 sounds, and the P400 is I care about that, I'm going to make a judgment, and if it's not there, then it just doesn't matter. Doesn't come to conscious awareness. So now we can take those difference waves, so all the blue waves here, and compare our groups, because that's what we're going to look at, is how the groups differ in terms of how they separate sounds. And there's a lot on here as well, so again, we'll go through it slowly. So we'll start with the ORN, the automatic processing, and we'll start with our younger adults. So we're looking at the size of the response here. So this the amplitude is correlated generally with either the amount of neurons firing, more neurons are going to lead to a larger response, or the synchrony of them, that the neurons are working more together. So it could be the same number of neurons, but they're actually working together better. And that's going to give rise to a larger amplitude. And what we see is that younger musicians, the ORN is enhanced, both in active and in passive listening. In older adults, we don't actually see that pattern. So the older musicians, the horn is no bigger in older musicians than in older non-musicians. And in fact, in active listening, the horn was actually larger in the non-musicians. And I have a good explanation for that, but it requires quite a tangent to get into. So if anybody's interested, ask me after. But because we're focusing on automatic processing, the non-difference in passive listening, we sort of take as indicative of automatic processing is not enhanced in older musicians. But then when we look at the P400, now this is the conscious registration of the sound. Now what I've just done here is divided it up into 2 time frames. So there's an earlier time frame and a later time frame, and it's just sort of dividing it along this midpoint, right along here, basically. And what we see is that the benefit in younger adults, and here now we're looking at younger musicians and non-musicians, is in the early phase of that. And eventually, actually, the response ends up being a similar amplitude at a later stage of that response. And we see a much bigger across both in the older musicians compared to the older non-musicians. Now remember, they were performing this task as well as the younger musicians. The older musicians were doing the task as well as the younger musicians, but their brain patterns are different. So here, it seems that the younger adults have better automatic processing. Their brain is just sort of better filtering out, there's 2 sounds versus 1, and they're getting a better signal to their conscious awareness. The older musicians seem to be using their more cognitive effort or a listening strategy to sort of figure out whether there's 2 sounds there. Basically, they've learned to listen better, and they're better at processing a degraded auditory input, that's likely been impacted by aging. So, we know that auditory processing abilities are enhanced in older musicians, and it's likely due to enhanced cognitive processing of acoustic information. So why is that? So we know there's age-related decline in the automatic encoding of acoustic information. We talk about disrupted neural timing. The signal coming in from the periphery is worse. And so it's likely to maintain good hearing abilities if you're going to be a performing musician or even an active musician as you get older. You have to compensate by using a listening strategy. Learn to deal with this degraded auditory input at a higher level. And this strategy strengthens the cognitive mechanisms in the brain that are related to hearing and drives this neuroplasticity that we saw in musicians. So we've talked about beeps and buzzes, and how does that relate to actual speech and noise processing? So I'm now going to talk about the neural mechanisms related to actually processing speech and noise. And I'm just going to talk about younger adults first, because I don't have data for older adults yet, but I do have an interesting follow-up, but the data's coming, so we'll get there. Here we took 26 healthy younger adults, all had good hearing, native French speakers. This study was done in Montreal, so all the stimuli are in French. The target stimuli were 150 monosyllabic, consonant, vowel, consonant, common French words, presented binaurally, and in 3 conditions with multi-talk or babble noise. So a lot like the stimuli we had before, but this time we're just looking at single words because we want to measure an evoked response, and so we need a short stimulus. And again, like the last study, we had 2 conditions. One, an active condition. So what do we get them to do? How do we know they heard the word correctly, or they had to repeat it aloud? And it was judged right away by somebody listening. Did they repeat it correctly? Did they not? And a passive listening, again, where they just watched a silent movie. So I'll play the stimulus, what they heard for you right now. You're going to hear some background babble noise, and you'll start hearing words on top of it. The noise starts out loud and gets quieter and then disappears to hear the 3 conditions.
Compréhension des capacités
Sœur, sport, rythme, plaine.
So that's the type of stimuli they heard while they were reporting their brain activity. So first, let's look at behavioral performance. So what I've labeled here is this is no background noise. This is a plus 15, a signal noise ratio of 15. So the signal was a middle condition where it was quite a bit louder, and this was the loudest condition where noise was loud. Basically, performance is near ceiling in these 2 conditions. Repeating the word aloud that you can hear clearly is not a difficult task in your native language. Where we did see a benefit was when noise was loud. The musicians repeated about 10% more of the words back correctly than the non-musicians. There we go. Now what about their brain responses? So these are the responses to to the word during active passive listening. Here's musicians, here's non-musicians. And we plotted them separately by their sound level. So this is the easiest condition, blue would be the middle, and red is the hardest. So the first thing you see that's obvious is that these the sort of big responses decline. And that's likely because the response is not as, the fidelity of the response has gone down. The neurons can't actually synchronize to the word as well because it's got all this other stuff going on. So the response decreases overall. Now what's important is the difference between our groups, because that's what we're looking at, is what's the benefit that musicians have, in this case younger musicians. And for younger musicians, we found that the earliest response we can measure, so it's called P1, occurs 50 milliseconds after the word starts. So basically during the first sort of sound coming out of the person's mouth, the brain starts to respond. It's the first response that you get in the auditory cortex. And it was larger in musicians compared to non-musicians. So this stage is automatic. Doesn't matter if they're awake, asleep. You're going to measure this brain response. It's just the brain, the auditory cortex saying, I hear a sound. And what it suggests is that because the brainstem, as it leads to the auditory cortex, is refining the sounds and trying to pick out what harmonics go with the speech and what harmonics are unimportant to what's coming in, it likely represents a more robust encoding of the word coming into the auditory cortex in the musicians. It's related to that. And we know it's actually related to how well they do because if we take P1 amplitude in the loudest condition, so this is the most difficult condition, and look at how many words they got correct. For musicians, there was a relationship. As P1 gets bigger in the group of musicians, they repeated more words correctly, they did better. So the musicians who had a bigger P1 did better on the task. But not the non-musicians. The P1 was not related at all to their performance. So that's a little strange. But what we did find was that another component of the ERP was modified, but only in the non-musicians. And this is, so what I've done here is, where I go, sorry, they all popped up, is subtracted the active and passive listening conditions. So to isolate, like the same way we want to isolate neural processes related to separating two sounds, here we're isolating the neural processes related specifically to attention, in this case, to isolate lexical access. So when you're not listening to them, when you're not paying attention to the words when you're watching a movie, you don't really need to process the words at all. When you have to repeat them aloud, you need to figure out what word you heard. And there's a really well-studied ERP called the N400. So it occurs a little bit after the P1, around 400 milliseconds. And it's considered to be related to your sort of mental lexicon. It's an index of looking up words in your word database, basically, is what a lot of researchers describe it. And generally what we find is that common words evoke a smaller N400, because common words are easy to find in your mental lexicon. You hear the word and, but, I all the time. But harder words, more complicated words that you don't come across all the time, like electrophysiology, take longer to look up and require more neural effort to look in. So the larger the N400 is, the harder the task is. And we actually see that perfectly in non-musicians. So there's the loudest condition, there's our N400 is big, the middle condition is in the middle, and in the quiet condition it's much smaller. So they're getting a word in, it's probably not processed as well because their P1 wasn't enhanced. And, oops. So the N400 gets bigger by noise. In the musicians, we found a delay in the N400, but no difference in amplitude. Likely because they're filtering out the background sound before they have to send it to their mental dictionary. So the word is actually more robustly represented in the brain, and they can look it up in their mental lexicon faster and more efficiently, so the N400 doesn't modulate based on noise. We would expect if we had done this study with a more difficult listening situation, with a lot more noise, maybe we would start getting modulation of the N400. And the important thing too is these responses are only to words that were repeated correctly. So we took out all the words that were not repeated correctly. And how do we know that this is related to task performance? So we have here are within subject brain behavior correlations. So each of these lines represents one participant. And what we have here is N400 amplitude plotted as a function of each of the difference in their difference in N400 as the difference from their medium to loud behavioral performance. So what we see is that the N400 increased more in amplitude in people who did worse as the noise got louder. So if they were repeating less words correctly, their N400 got bigger, so it suggests they were relying more on that process. But this was only significant for the non-musicians. The musicians, you can see the lines go in sort of all different directions. In the non-musicians, they all tend to slow downward and show that relationship that as you repeat less words correctly, your N400 amplitude goes up. So early cognitive processing of speech sounds are enhanced in musicians, and we saw that with the enhanced P1. This facilitates lexical access for the musicians because we saw no impact of noise on the N400 musicians, and it suggests that musical training can improve how the brain becomes speech and background noise. So it suggests we've improved automatic processing, much like we saw in the last study. So what about older adults? I don't have data with that study, but we are collecting some. So all the studies I've talked about right now have compared musicians and non-musicians. And I've said musical training is improving hearing abilities. But there's a big problem with all of that, and it could all be wrong, is that what if people who become musicians have better hearing to begin with? And all we've done is measure people who have good hearing who happen to become musicians. And that's the problem with doing cross-sectional experiments, is that you don't control that factor. I don't know why they became a musician. I just know that I tested them 50 years after they did, and that they had better hearing than somebody who chose not to do that with their life. So, and it's totally feasible. You imagine a kid sitting at a piano, if they can't hear the difference between two notes, they're probably going to want to quit. Or another kid that can hear the difference would probably not want to quit. So the question is there a causal effect of musical training? And then the sort of follow-up is then, can we use music training to rehabilitate decline in central processing of central auditory processing? So we did a randomized control design. It's the same way we test a drug. So healthy older adults who were non-musicians and non-video game players, I'll explain that in a sec, and randomly assigned them into one of three groups. One was going to take music lessons, and we needed a placebo control. So they had to do something that wasn't music lessons, so we can show that it's not just doing something that improves your hearing, but doing something specific improves your hearing. So we had a video game group, and the reason we chose a video game was because there's emerging evidence that certain types of video games can actually improve your spatial processing, visual processing of information in the brain, and music improves hearing. So we sort of teamed up with a visual researcher, and we served as each other's controls for this study. And then a control group that just did nothing. So this is a no-contact group. We did an assessment. They did 30 hours of practice over 12 weeks on either piano lessons, Super Mario 64, nothing. Another assessment, another 30 hours of practice and a post-training assessment. I'll show you the music lessons. Again, to match with video games, they were done at home. They were self-directed. And because we can't teach them to read music very quickly, and most musicians take 10, 15 years to become experts, we needed something that was easy, but still sort of got at the basic ideas of music. So what you'll see is this woman is, first time she sat at a piano, and you can sort of see on her computer screen, there's a little piano layout, and anybody who's played Guitar Hero, it's the same type of idea. There's just bars that fall and show her which note to play. There's a metronome that's occurring at the same time, so she gets acoustic information as to when timing comes. And all she has to do in this task is tap middle C in time to a metronome. Very good. I was actually surprised. I thought people would be a little better at that, but that's the way things are. So we come back 6 months later, and we obviously did not create Beethoven or Mozart, a great musician, but I was actually shocked at her level of improvement, so now she'll play a bit of Beethoven. So, not great, but a dramatic improvement for 6 months, and she did that all herself. So basically, we give her one lesson on how to use the software, and it moves her through a series of lessons from tapping middle C to alternating between notes and going through that. So the video game condition, just as an aside, they play Super Mario 64. It's a three-dimensional video game where you navigate an environment. And in younger people, it's been shown to improve cognitive abilities related to spatial navigation and has neuroplasticity in terms of enlarging the hippocampus. So my colleagues investigate whether you can improve visual and spatial awareness in older adults by using this type of training. So we did a whole bunch of assessments. We had people coming for 6 months. So we have MRI, EEG experiments, hearing tests. There's a whole host of other tests that were done by the visual researcher that I'm not even listing here. And the study just finished in January. So the data is sort of just coming in. And I have some very preliminary data that I took from a few months ago that I was able to sort of get together. So here what I've done is average the first 6 participants in the music group. And they did basically the same hearing test that we talked about and I talked about the last few studies. So they did 2 measures of gap detection. I'm not going to explain sort of the difference between the 2 of them. But basically on both measures, there's their pre-training. In this case, better hearing is down. And after training, with just 6 people, we're getting statistically significant improvements in their ability to detect a gap. After training, we did mistune harmonic detection, same task that we talked about earlier. Again, after training, pre-training, midterm training, post-training, we see an improvement. And the big one, speech and noise, in this case, better hearing is up here, and we see a slight improvement that is statistically significant with just 6 people. There's the increase there. Now again, we have to compare that to control groups to make sure it's not just due to repeated testing, things like that, but the evidence is positive for 6 people. That ERP study with hearing words and noise that I presented before, but didn't have data for older adults, we did it with this group of older adults. So we're not going to have a group of older adults to compare, but we're going to use the younger adults as a standard and then see how the older adults do before and after training, and whether they look like the younger musicians, the younger non-musicians, how things change. But the promising thing is that they did improve in their loud noise condition. So after training, they're repeating more words correctly when noise was loud. They improved by almost 10% in terms of how many words they can repeat. So what we expect, but I haven't had a chance to go look at the data yet, is that we should probably impact something to do with the N400, because we've seen in the previous study that older adults, the benefit seems to be with the cognitive processing stage of hearing, not the automatic encoding. So what we saw in younger adults, that pattern probably won't replicate in older adults. We should see something a bit different. So that's pretty much all I have to say for today. So I'll leave you with a few take-home messages. Age-related decline in auditory processing abilities are mitigated in older musicians, likely due to enhanced cognitive processing of acoustic information. And preliminary results suggest this is actually a causal relationship at some level. And this means that we can use music training to serve as a foundation to develop auditory rehabilitation programs for older adults to help with things like speech and noise perception. Thank you all for listening. Questions?
I'm just wondering if you noticed any effects of handedness, like whether people were right-handed or left-handed.
It's a good question. I don't test left-handed people. And the reason, so yeah, I know it sounds terrible. There's been a general, it's changing now, there's a general trend in most neuroscience to avoid left-handed people because their brains are sometimes wired a bit differently. So you have some people where everything is switched, some people where certain functions are much more bilateral, and because of that, the sort of general MO is to just not test left-handed people very much. So I don't know the answer to your question. Yep.
Do you test bilingual people?
Yes, and there's, in Montreal, all the participants were bilingual. They all speak English at some level, some were better than others. In Toronto, also, many of the older participants were. We were testing, the requirements for doing speech and noise testing is that you can only do it in your first language. Even people who learn a second language when they're a year old can show measurable differences on the ability to understand speech and noise. So it's a very sensitive measure. So everybody, we sort of figured who was bilingual, but they were all first, like whatever language the test was done in was their first language. There's some evidence now that bilingualism leads to benefits in cognition. There's a sort of a big debate actually right now. Is there's some studies that have shown that things like cognitive decline occur on average, I think 5 or 6 years later in people who are actively bilingual compared to people who are not actively bilingual, but there's sort of a big debate in the literature. So I haven't focused on really teasing apart bilingualism as a way to study speech and noise, but again, it's difficult because even unless you're bilingual from birth, and that really means from birth, where one parent is speaking to in one language and the other parent is speaking into a different language, you can't really do speech and noise type testing in both languages because you'll always show measurable deficit in whatever language appeared second, even if it's only a year or two after you were born.
So do you control for that given your Montreal population?
Well, everybody was bilingual,
But
both
from
the
birth
musicians and
or
the non-musicians. Sorry.
sequential, or like, I mean, what type of bilinguals are we talking?
Yeah, I mean we asked them, but it wasn't really included in the analysis at all. Sort of would have really complicated things about how much then we have to quantify, like because all of them were basically students at UTM, so they're all main speaking French, and then some of them were completely fluent in English, others were functional English. Most of them, I'm pretty sure all of them checked that as a box on the questionnaire. I don't know if it would contribute to the ability to sort of help if you speak a different language to understand speech and noise in your native language. I guess that would be sort of the question there, is if you're bilingual, whether you have a benefit in your own language. And I think you could sort of make both arguments. I mean, some people would argue, I guess, you have enhanced cognitive resources related to hearing different types of sounds, so you might hear better, but then other people might say, well, you have less practice. And so because you speak a different language half the time, you have less practice in one language, so people who are monolingual are spending more time in that language, and practice effects are known to enhance ability. So it's an interesting question, but I just don't know the answer.
My question was actually, well, this is all like cool stuff, but my question was about your M400, because we know that there's a difference in M400 behaviors between bilingual speakers and non-bilinguals. I mean, but now you're saying that they all tested in their dominant language, and so I guess you're kind of controlling for that. Well, to the extent you could. So.
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree. If we would have done this, like if it was French students doing the test in English, then there'd be a huge effect on the N400 because you'd have, I mean, it's possible people just wouldn't understand some of the words, right? I don't know how fluent they would have been in their language, but in this case, like because it's always people speaking their native language and testing in their native language. So the idea of sort of speaking other languages, we asked people about it, and that was sort of the extent of it. And I didn't really follow up with any major analysis on that because in the sample of people in Montreal, everybody sort of checked bilingual. We didn't do a more extensive questionnaire saying like when did you first learn English? When did you how many hours a week did you spend speaking English? Things like that. It was really hard to sort of do any analysis on that.
Well, I'm from Quebec, and I got friends that are lots of friends are musicians in Montreal, and it's my sense that among the musicians, the level of bilingualism tends to be higher than among the non-musicians. So that's the basis of all my questions.
Right. So the question is like, is it bilingualism that's driving it? So
or influencing it. I mean, I'm not talking about.
Yeah.
Right.
So the answer is every person said they were bilingual on the test when we asked the question. So, but sort of teasing apart how good they actually were, I didn't give any of them an English language test, so I can't sort of delve further into that. Anything else?
Do you have any sense of whether musicians will perceive category boundaries in different places? Like, so if you play them a continuum of, say, vowel articulations, if they'll place boundaries across.
Categorical perception shifts.
Yeah.
I don't know the answer to that question. There's one, so it's not exactly the same, but I know there was one study that's looked at tone languages and found that musicians who were non-tone language speakers were much better able to distinguish tones in Mandarin without any exposure to them. They would just play different sounds, and they could like almost reliably as native Mandarin speakers identify those tones. Category boundaries, I don't know. Those are established when you're an infant. Like those are really early, and it would. I mean, I imagine if I don't know. It's an interesting question. Whether those category boundaries are flexible in musicians, because it would sort of hinder your speech perception if they were too flexible, because you'd start hearing too much variability in different speakers.
Right.
But it might be one of those things that, like, if you're really good at processing sound, you can sort of turn it on and off, maybe.
Yeah.
I'm not sure, because it's one of those really like categorical perception develops really, really early, right? So it's in like I think in the first 18 months they're pretty solidified. So so I don't know if you see a benefit, but it's a good question.
There is some evidence that you can reshape these phonemic inventories and add to. You start off early in life with X, Y, and Z belonging to, say, the high front E vowel, but then you can, once you acquire some experience with other dialects, you start to be a little more tolerant or flexible with the phonetic space that is associated with the category. And I guess in some sense, my question would be: are musicians more tolerant of deviations?
So, right, and again, this sort of hits the edge of the perception of sort of this sort of linguistic perception, speech perception, sort of the boundary, sort of what. My knowledge of how things go. This might be an open area for collaboration.
No, so it would be
department. So it's definitely possible. It would be one of those interesting things because people who are familiar, if what you're saying, I believe what you're saying is true, but musical training, like you're not, unless you're a singer, of course, where you are dealing with singing in other languages, you're not really training that exactly, but it's surprising that you see a benefit. You're not training speech and noise either, right? But you see a benefit in musical training to speech and noise. We understand that they rely on similar neural mechanisms that until the brain figures out its speech or music or whatever, it's the same auditory system that's doing it. So whether that plays out with category, it's an interesting question.
And are all musicians created equal? Like, is a drummer who doesn't necessarily do anything with tone? Or
Great question. I get that one a lot, and so I'll actually tell you about one of my participants who was a drummer. So we did the gap detection test with a guy. He must have been in his 50s, 40s. He was a line drummer, so he played in like a marching band, played snare drum, and he beat the gap detection test. So the gap detection test is a pure tone, and the stimulus is created by we pick out waves, right? So it's sampled to a certain rate, and the smallest gap we can create is taking one wave out of the sound, right? So it's like oscillating at 200 hertz, so we have 200 waves a second, so we take one wave out, and that's the smallest gap we can create without the sound actually just continuing, and he could reliably detect it all the time. He beat the test. We couldn't create a stimulus that he couldn't detect the gap on, and so afterwards, I've never seen anybody with this ability before, how did you do it? He said, that test is really like playing a line drum, and he was saying that when you play in a line drum, you have to be really aware of deviations from each, because if the person next to you makes a mistake and you follow that mistake, then the person next to you follows that mistake, and then everybody starts making that mistake down the line. And so the training is actually to be really sensitive to hearing those sort of gaps, if you will, like a small deviance from when the sound onset is supposed to be. And a drum is a nice sharp transient onset. And so he's trained to identify hear those gaps, and ignore them. So all we did was say, okay, now pay attention to them. And he was able to beat the test. So there's some specificity based on that, but he also did well on sort of the pitch tests and the speech tests. So there's probably some general mechanism and then some specificity that goes on top of it, depending on what you play. You probably see things with people who play non-fixed pitched instruments like violins, where you have to find the note each time, having better pitch perception than people who play piano and things like that, where they don't have to find the note. Cool. Yep.
I don't know if it's relevant. To me, I'm kind of nearsighted, but I have a good ability to listen. So, is there some differences between the musician who has a good, normal musicians and the musician with some kind of nearsightedness, who have some problem in
and seeing, right? So speech perception is hugely multimodal, and here we're doing tasks where people don't see what people are saying, but often, like if you're at a noisy bar and it's impossible to hear people, the first thing you do is stare at their lips, right? Because that's going to help you hear them. And there's all sorts of effects. If anybody, I don't know if you've seen the McGurk effect or if people know what that is. If there's students in here that don't know the McGurk effect, look it up on YouTube. It's pretty cool. Basically, you can change what you hear based on the way lips move, right? So that's going to play a big role. I didn't look into that. It's a whole getting into sort of multimodal processing. It's a whole other level. But there's a good, it's definitely possible that musicians might be better at knowing where to look. It seems like they're better at sort of guiding their attention to the right sound components, so maybe they're better at guiding their eyes to the right visual components. But it's a great question. I don't know the answer, and somebody should look into it. Yep.
I think it would be interesting to look at DJs because they do have that musical inclination, but if they're playing like in a really loud club, chances are they, might have to rely on that multimodal that you're talking about. Because they can't really hear like someone comes up for a request or something like that. So I mean that could be.
So it's interesting with DJs. One of the findings in the field has been I'm not sure that a DJ would necessarily count as a musician. Some people might disagree with me on that. But so they've done studies where they basically compared. They had people who did a really active listening task where they would listen to a piano performance basically, and it was people learning to play the piano. So they took two groups. One group learned to play the piano, just simple melodies, and they made lots of mistakes and they got better. Another group that just listened and every time they heard a mistake in somebody who was learning to play the piano, they had to press a button. So they weren't learning to play the piano; they just had to hear the mistake. So the stimulus was exactly the same between two groups. One person was actually interacting with the musical instrument where they were producing sound. And they showed a benefit where people who were just listening and detecting errors and sort of processing but not actually physically interacting with space showed no difference in their auditory processing abilities afterwards. So a lot of the benefits with musical training, the thought is that it's because playing an instrument is so multimodal that if you're taking a visual input, you're taking auditory inputs, you're integrating it into very fine motor movements, and they're getting feedback from the tactile system in your fingers or in your throat or whatever instrument it is you play, and feeding that back into the system along with the visual input and the auditory that drives the change in the auditory system. So depending on what type of DJ they were, so like club DJs that are just playing tracks over and over again, maybe not, but some of the other DJs that are doing production and actually creating music, like scratching records or things like that, maybe you might see a benefit. The more likely a club DJ is just going to have a lot of peripheral variables. Yeah.
Well, thank you very much for speaking to us today. That's very good.